In our previous discussions regarding the lessons of the French Revolution, we found that nationalism was a powerful force, both in shaping world history, but also in shaping identity. And we understood from the very beginning of the first related issue that identity basically are those key factors that people use to determine who they are, to determine their uniqueness, and to distinguish themselves. And if you remember, we found that there were individualistic factors such as family and hobbies, likes, dislikes, and that there were group or collective characteristics or factors such as gender or religion or occupation. One of the other factors we found to be, as far as a group characteristic, was nationalistic identity, and we understood the sense of belonging that an individual has, that goes along with wanting to become part of a nation, is a group factor. Well, these nationalistic identities also have nationalistic loyalties. And so what we see is that in relation to identity, some of the other key factors are loyalties, and there are individual loyalties, and there are nationalist loyalties, and there are non-nationalist loyalties. And so we want to take some time at this moment to actually take a look at loyalties, both nationalist and non-nationalist in nature, and see how they relate to identity. So let's look at non-nationalist loyalties. Well, first of all, non-nationalist loyalties are basically those loyalties that are not embedded in the idea of nation. So those loyalties that people have that do not relate to the idea of being part of a nation. So examples might be a loyalty to a family or to a friend or to school or even a region. These are examples of loyalties, but they're not nationalist loyalties. They're not embedded or related directly to the idea of belonging to a nation. Now, and you can see by the type of loyalties we've used as examples of non-nationalist loyalties that they are in some ways similar to nationalist loyalties, and there isn't always a clear separation between these two. Non-nationalist loyalties, for example, are interconnected, and as are all loyalties, to either an idea, a collective, or a group. And sometimes the group or collective may not be specifically that of a nation, but it still may be collective in nature, and so we see that the separation is not always clear-cut. Now, sometimes these non-nationalist loyalties, when they are related to a collective or to a group, can develop into nationalist loyalties. For example, the Quebecois had loyalties other than to nationalist loyalties if we consider Canada as the nation, and their loyalty was to an idea and to a collective, the idea that the French people in Quebec are unique and that there are a language group with a common history, and that can develop and has at times almost developed into a nationalist loyalty, with separation almost occurring on at least one occasion in Quebec history. Here's another example of a non-nationalist loyalty that actually develops into a nationalist loyalty. You recall when the Third Estate rebelled against the church and the nobles and actually demanded that representation in the estates generally be based on population, that their loyalty at that moment was a class loyalty. It was a loyalty based on the Third Estate to all those French people, the 25 million French people at the time, that had very little government recognition or rights and paid all of the taxes. And so what happens during the course of the early part of the French Revolution is that this class loyalty transforms into a nationalist loyalty. Sometimes nationalist and non-nationalist loyalties compete. And an example would be at first with the Third Estate, whereby this class loyalty was competing with the nationalist loyalty of that of the French state as represented by the French crown and the French nobility. And class loyalty, again, is one in which you see where most societies are divided into social economic classes, not always as sharp and clear-cut as French society of the 1780s, but there are class loyalties nevertheless that develop because of divisions within society. Now these divisions, such as were definitely the case in the French monarchy of the 1780s, they're often based on wealth or status or level of education. Sometimes they're based on ethnicity. For example, if people don't accept these divisions or feel one class is being favored or preferred over another, conflict can result. And certainly that was the case in the French Revolution. Now we understand that class during the 1780s in France was very clear-cut and was very much one in which certain classes were favored over others. In this case, the first two estates, that of the higher clergy and of the nobility, certainly were favored over that of the third estate of the common French citizen. But it's not just France where we see that happen. Canada, for example, has classes within it. Sometimes Canada has been referred to as a vertical mosaic, where we see the lowest classes tending to be in Canada, tending to be social classes, tending to be Aboriginal peoples, and often disenfranchised and with lower education levels and with higher rates of poverty. And we have seen in Canadian history that this has actually led to conflict as well. And again, as mentioned previously, the French Revolution is probably the best example of this. There are religious loyalties too. In countries like Canada, people of different religions coexist peacefully. But this isn't always the case, and it hasn't always been the case in Canada. Sometimes religious loyalties compete with nationalist loyalties. In Iraq, for example, over the course of the last 15 years, conflict has existed with violence occurring almost on a daily basis between Sunni and Shiite Islamic sects. Now, the Sunni and Shiite are both sects of the same religion, but they see each other as enemies and basically as blasphemous of the Islamic religion. And so in Iraq, even though there is an Iraqi state, the religious loyalties seem to take precedence over that of the nationalist loyalties. So we see here an example of nationalist and non-nationalist loyalties competing. The civil war in Syria, which is going on right now between the rebel government, between the rebel and the government forces, is certainly a case of this, because it's largely based on religion as well. The rebels are basically all Sunnis, and the government forces are basically Alawites, which is a sect of the Shiite religion of Islam, and also the Christians and the Kurds within Syria are also fighting on behalf of the government. So we see, certainly, in this case, religious and on top of it ethnic loyalties in competition and in conflict with nationalist loyalties. Regional loyalties sometimes also are in conflict, in competition with nationalist loyalties. In some instances, loyalties to regions and country come into a great conflict. Now, this hasn't happened in Canada, but there has been tension as regards regional loyalties within Canada and in regards to the state, the federal government, and so nationalist loyalties. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, Albertans had conflicting loyalties between the province and the federal government. Albertans quite often saw themselves on the short end of the stick, with the federal government imposing regulations and policies that were economically disadvantageous to the Alberta province, particularly as relates to the oil industry. Alberta is not the only region where there has been conflict. Certainly, the case of Quebec would be another example, and the two referendums and the attempt to separate on two occasions exemplifies this. And even with the Maritimes in eastern Canada, there has been some degree of tension with the federal government. So these various regional tensions within Canadian history and within Canada certainly exemplify the idea of regional loyalties, and that they're an example of a non-nationalist loyalty that is in conflict with a nationalist loyalty. And as I had mentioned in relation to Alberta, there was actual political confrontation between Peter Lougheed, the Premier of Alberta at the time, and Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. And this was in regards to the National Energy Program that the federal government had put into place, which imposed regulations that the Premier of Alberta and the Alberta provincial government saw as hurting the oil industry and thus hurting Alberta's economy. And so many Albertans were sort of in a bind in relation to being in cross purposes as regards their loyalties to the province and to the country. So we see that there are nationalist loyalties and non-nationalist loyalties, and they sometimes are similar, and sometimes the differences are not clear-cut. And often, and in many cases, these nationalist and non-nationalist loyalties come into competition and sometimes into actual conflict.